So this research has to do with thinking about how to enhance charitable giving by motivating consumers to give. That's sort of the first question. And within that question, the second question we're looking at is how to make them give time instead of money. And so we're interested in factors that increase the likelihood that consumers will be more likely to give time when they're asked to donate as opposed to money. Well, what we find is that when you're attempting to get consumers to give time, a very effective strategy is to make them think about themselves as moral individuals. There's two ways to do this. One way is to trigger something internal to them so that they see themselves as moral people. The other way is to provide them with external cues that make them think about their morality. And so the combination of these two things can increase the likelihood that we find that they will want to give time instead of money. Well, we were surprised to find that you have to be careful when you are trying to put moral cues in front of people because they can be very powerful. For example, if you get them to start thinking about moral individuals like Mother Teresa, sometimes what can happen is they feel like they can't reach that moral ideal, so they end up not doing anything from a moral perspective because it's too far afield of how they would want to see themselves or how they believe they could see themselves. The other thing is that we have to be careful because sometimes if you get them to think about their moral identity, they'll think about moral things they've done in the past, and on that particular instance that you ask them to do something, they'll choose not to do it because they have kind of built up this moral surplus in the moral bank account, so to speak. So the way you have to trigger moral thoughts is in a very subtle way to not be too powerful to drive these two types of effects that I just mentioned. The research that we're doing suggests the following. So if you're designing a persuasive communication, let's say you're putting out a brochure that's part of a mass mailing, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to include in that brochure symbols and cues in the writing, in the request for help that will trigger this notion of morality. Cues like words that might be related to morality, like compassion and caring and these kinds of things. These are words that when people read them, they think about these words and how these words relate to who they are. And in some instances that we find in the research, these words, just these words, the presence of these words in the persuasive communication will trigger in their minds a sense of morality that they should do something, and in turn will increase the likelihood that they give time. I think that there's a misperception that it's too difficult to make people give time. Here's why. Time is a very special resource compared to money. People don't want to give time to just anybody, right? So what we find in the research is that all things equal, people want to give money because giving time has certain distinct psychological costs to it. For example, time is very finite. Money is fungible, but you only have 24 hours in the day. So you're going to choose to give that time to particular close others. So when you're thinking about trying to get people to do something, to give time to a pro-social cause where those benefactors are strangers, then it's hard to do. And people think it's almost impossible because the fact that giving time, people have this aversion to doing it. And what we find is that you can overcome this aversion by playing into a person's moral self or presenting them with cues that get them to think about themselves as moral individuals, and then that overcomes this aversion to giving time in particular instances. There's the discussion about how to get people to give time, and it turns out that folks who are part of the millennial group tend to want to give time a bit more than other groups. And so our research says that, even though these millennials want to give time, there's a huge group of other folks that aren't millennials who we need to focus on as well, who may not have this internal sort of predisposition to want to give time. And so our research really focuses on how to bring those other groups into the fray by motivating them to give time through what we show in our paper. And that's exactly what we find in the research, is that the act of giving time has these psychological benefits that money doesn't have. So it's a more meaningful act. It's more self-expressive for people who are thinking about themselves as moral individuals. It is also much more meaningful, and it creates happiness for people and a sense of connectedness for those who are receiving the time that money just can't. Well, this research is special in the sense that most of the studies that are done on giving have to do with measuring people and measuring their behavior over time. And those studies are correlational. Our studies, what sets apart our studies is the fact that we use causal experiments and we bring people into the lab and we can clearly manipulate things to see what's changing their behavior. And at the end of that, we can conclude it's exactly what we were imposing on them in terms of their thought processes that actually drove what they did. And you can't conclude that in a correlational study. So I'm super interested in the role that moral identity plays in terms of how it relates to emotions. Emotions like empathy, awe, and these kinds of moral elevation experiences. And so what I'm also particularly interested in is the idea of how does the act of giving subsequently reinforce a person's moral identity? So in our paper, we're looking at the role that moral identity plays on giving, but I'd like to actually reverse that relationship and see to what extent are certain types of giving related to strengthening how a person sees themselves as a moral individual.